to not mention the first 10 years, because the problems only occurred in the last 2 years of his khilafah. And most books only focus on these 2 years. And it's not fair to not mention all of the good that happened in these 10 years and only focus on the 2 years of fitna. And as we said, he's part of the rightly guided khilafah. And if he were not a good ruler, he would not be part of the rightly guided khilafah. Of the territories that were added to Islamic lands, conquest continued during the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And the Muslim lands extended from Tripoli, which is Libya, to Algeria, as far west as Algeria. And the Muslims entered the lands of Cyprus, and they went into eastern Turkey, and they went into Armenia, north of Dagestan, or in English called Dagestan, which is a region of southeast Russia, bordering on the Caspian Sea. And they also entered the area of Sindh, which is a region of southern Pakistan along the lower Indus River. And then they also conquered Ray. When we hear Ray, this is actually what is Tehran right now. Tehran in Iran, which used to be under Persian territory. And another important thing that happened during his reign is that there was no such thing as the Persian Empire anymore. He took care of the Persian Empire, destroyed it. And there were two superpowers in the world at the time, and before the Muslims. There was Persia and there were the Romans. And during the reign of Uthman radiallahu anhu, there was no such thing as Persia anymore. Destroyed the Persian Empire. And they sent the Romans out of Egypt and they sent them out of Palestine. And there was much abundance of good during his time. Muhammad ibn Sirin says, wealth increased during the rule of Uthman. A slave girl could be sold for her weight in money, and a horse for 100,000 dirhams, and a palm tree for 1,000 dirhams. And Al-Hasan ibn Ali radiallahu anhu says, the provisions were abundant during the Khilafah of Uthman. And as the Khalifa, he used to lead the believers in Hajj 10 years in a row. We said he was the Khalifa for 12 years. 1 year was known as Amul Ri'af, which is people were stricken with nosebleeds. And Uthman radiallahu anhu also had this bleeding from the nose. So he couldn't go to Hajj that year. And the other year that he didn't go was when he was besieged in the same year that he was killed. He was besieged in his home and he couldn't go out to Hajj. And one of the other things that he did during his reign is he also expanded the Masjid of the Prophet ﷺ. This is the second expansion. And he built it with stones this time. And he put stone pillars in it, and he made a firm roof, not just branches of date palms and so on. And he made its length 160 yards and its width 150 yards. And the conquests that took part during his reign were fought on land and on the sea. This is for the first time that the Muslims go into battle using ships and go into the battle on sea. And jihad continued for the 10 years of his 12-year reign, because of course in the last 2 years jihad halted because of the fitna. If you contemplate, you see how the fitan slow everything down and they take away the good from the ummah. And we would like to look at just quickly some events that took place during his reign. In the year 26 after the Hijrah, he expanded the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. And in the year 27 after the Hijrah, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu conquered Cyprus. And with him was Ubad ibn Samit, and the wife of Ubad ibn Samit, who was known as Haram bint Malhan from the Ansar. She had fallen off her riding animal and she was buried there, just as the Prophet ﷺ had made dua for her. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned this army entering this area of Cyprus, and she asked the Prophet ﷺ to make dua for her, that she's amongst them. And he made dua for her, and she went there and she died and she was buried in Cyprus. And in the 28th or 29th year, he expanded the masjid in Medina, and he built it, as we said, with stone this time. And in the 30th year after the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ used to have a ring with which he would seal the letters and the orders. And the Prophet ﷺ, when he died, he gave it to Aisha radiallahu anha. And then when the new Khalifa is chosen, Abu Bakr, she gives it to him. And then he seals all his letters and things with it. And when he dies, Umar uses it, takes it over. And then when he dies, he gives it to Hafsa to hold on to it until a new Khalifa is chosen. So then it's given to Uthman, and then in that same year, it fell into a well, the well at Quba. And Uthman radiallahu anh could not find it, and it saddened him very much to lose the ring of the Prophet ﷺ, and he eventually had one that was similar to it made. And in the 31st year after the Hijrah, we see the death of Abu Sufyan, Sakhr ibn Harb, who used to be one of the main enemies of Islam. He becomes a Muslim, and he dies in the 31st year after the Hijrah. And we also see the death of Al-Hakam ibn Abi al-As, If you remember him, the uncle of Uthman who used to torture him, he becomes a Muslim and he passes away now. So what's happening now? Now the Sahaba, they're starting to die off, becoming more and more like precious gems. Because at this time now you understand many reverts, many converts, many different people from all different lands of the Muslims. And then many of the Arabs becoming Muslim who never met the Prophet ﷺ, so they're not Sahaba. And now the Sahaba, as time passes, the further we move from the date of the Hijrah, Sahaba are passing away and they're becoming more and more precious to have a Sahabi amongst you. So they become like gems. These are the people who saw the Prophet ﷺ and defended him and learned from him. So they were precious and they were respected by everyone. And just incidentally, the scholars say that there are about 120,000 Sahaba. But nonetheless, some of them had certain merits, like being of the people of Badr and people who joined in all the battles and being the early Muslims. And these people were extremely valuable. And in the 32nd year after the Hijrah, we see the passing away of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf, one of the 10 given glad tidings of paradise. And then Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, an ocean of knowledge, a scholar amongst the companions, and one of the earliest of Muslims, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, passes away. And then Abu Darda al-Khuza'i, the pious and the wise man. And he was a judge of Damascus or of Damascus for the longest time under Muawiyah. And we see the passing away of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari and Zayd ibn Abdullah al-Ansari. Zayd ibn Abdullah, and what would make us know who is Zayd ibn Abdullah? Few people remember this name. He is the man who saw the adhan in the vision. Remember the story of the adhan when Umar came to mention it? A man had already seen it in a vision. Zayd ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu was the man who saw the adhan in his vision radiallahu anhu. So now the Sahaba are becoming rare and they're becoming, by the day, something that's more and more rare. And in the 33rd year after the Hijrah, we see Al-Miqdad ibn al-Aswad passing away. And in the 34th year after the Hijrah, the fitna begins. And it ends in the 35th year after the Hijrah with the murder of Uthman radiallahu anhu. So we see that during his time there were many great battles and they conquered a lot of lands. And all the details of these battles are available. The details of the first battle Muslims ever had on the sea with their ships, they were victorious. Even though it was their first battle, they were victorious. All these details are there. And we see the heroics of the Muslims at these times. But we'll suffice with just mentioning the gist of what happened during his Khilafah radiallahu anhu. And of his other virtues are that he was the first to migrate in the way of Allah. When he migrated to Abyssinia with the daughter of the Prophet ﷺ, Ruqayya, the Prophet ﷺ said that Uthman is the first to migrate in the way of Allah after the Prophet Lut. And he was the first to provide meals for all of those who fasted during Ramadan. And this is something we still do in the masajid. We provide meals for people who fast. Uthman radiallahu anhu was the first one to start this. And he was the first one to issue a salary for the mu'adhin, the people who make the adhan. He issued them a salary. And he was the first one to establish a police force. And he was the first person to gather a people upon one harf or one Quran. And this is the Quran we have today. When we open it on a certain page, they're all on the same ayah or the same surah. This is the harf of Uthman radiallahu anhu. And he made copies and distributed this to the major cities in the Muslim empire. And he was the first one to ban the flying of pigeons for wagers. People would bet against each other and then they would fly and race their pigeons. And he banned that officially. And he was the first in whose reign there was construction of naval fleets and there was naval warfare during his reign. He also ruled longest of all the four rightly guided khulafa, and he was also the richest amongst them, and he was the one who compiled the Quran. This was a description of Uthman radiallahu anhu and his life and his achievements, and we wanted to get to know his character and his personality so that when we discuss the fitna and the accusations leveled against him, we can make a judgment of whether or not they were befitting or even possible. So now we'll move on to the beginning of the fitna and the murder of Uthman radiallahu anhu. The fitna or the dissension and all the problems that started that led to the death of Uthman radiallahu anhu was started by a man by the name of Abdullah ibn Saba. And he's also known as Ibn Sawda because his mother was black, so they called him Ibn Sawda. And Abdullah ibn Saba was a Jew from Sana'a in Yemen. And he pretended that he was a Muslim. So he's a hypocrite coming into Islam because Islam had become powerful at this point, and he felt that the only way to defeat Islam was from a fitna from the inside. So he's trying to defeat Islam from the inside by creating these fitan and creating these problems. He starts to spread fitan. He first started in Medina. He comes to Medina and he tries to put shubuhat and bring these vague and strange questions in Medina. But of course all the scholars, the majority of scholars were in Medina, and the companions of the Prophet ﷺ were in Medina. So he wasn't able to do anything. There was not a single person who followed him. So the scholars stopped him and not a single person followed him. And this shows the importance of knowledge and scholars and how they protect people from going astray. So then he tries Asham. He goes to Asham. And in Asham, Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was the governor there for 20 years. And there was not a single fitna that arose in Asham. And later on when he becomes the Khalifa for 20 years, there was never a single fitna. For 40 years. So Muawiyah radiallahu anhu is a man who knows how to control fitan and how to control people and the problems they may cause. So then Ibn Sawda, Abdullah ibn Saba, was also unsuccessful there. And he heads to Al-Kufa. And he goes to Al-Kufa and he finds it to be ripe with fitan. Lots of problems going on. And that's why Umar radiallahu anhu, because of the nature of the people of Al-Kufa, Umar radiallahu anhu had put Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah as the governor there. And Mughira ibn Shu'bah radiallahu anhu is one of the companions. He was tough and he used to be the personal bodyguard of the Prophet ﷺ. So in the days of Umar there were no fitan in Kufa because Mughira ibn Shu'bah was the governor in charge there. So then when Uthman radiallahu anhu came and he became the Khalifa, he removed Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah and put Sa'id ibn al-As in his place. And for that reason, it was susceptible to being a good place to start a fitna. Abdullah ibn Saba tries to join forces with a lot of people. And if we look at the people of fitna, we'll find that a lot of them were thieves and highway robbers and people who were punished because they had transgressed the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We find Abdullah ibn Saba, he goes to a man by the name of Hakim ibn Jabala. And Hakim ibn Jabala was a man from Basra, and he was a highway robber. And he had like a band of criminals. And people knew that he was a highway robber, but they couldn't prove anything against him, and that's why he kept on robbing. And when his activities kind of went out of proportion, the matter was reported to the Khalifa, and Uthman writes to the governor of Basra to put Hakim ibn Jabala in detention, and they implemented this order. So then when Abdullah ibn Saba hears of him, he goes out. He reaches Basra and he stays with Hakim ibn Jabala. And he starts to create doubts in his mind and in the minds of other Muslims there. First he presented himself as a well-wisher for the Muslims and one who loved the family of the Prophet ﷺ. And after he started gaining the trust of the Muslims, he began to ask and raise other questions. He first raised the question, he said that if Isa alayhi salam is going to come back to this world, why not Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is better than Isa. So he then starts to use this ayah to support his argument. He says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, إِنَّ الَّذِي فَرَضَ عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنِ لَرَادُّكَ إِلَى مَعَادٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, verily he who has given you the Quran will surely bring you back to a place of return. So he's saying that in this ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is promising that the Prophet ﷺ is going to return. But of course this ayah was revealed in Mecca, and when the Prophet ﷺ was being sent out of Mecca, Allah reveals this ayah promising the Prophet ﷺ that he's going to come back. The place of return, the ma'ad here, is speaking about Mecca. But he's using this ayah now to show that the Prophet ﷺ is returning back to earth. These same questions were asked before by a man, and his name was Al-Usaybigh. He used to ask these exact same questions during the reign of Umar radiallahu anhu. And when that happened, Umar had him sent to Medina, and he whipped him 3 times. He would whip him the first time until his flesh showed in his back. And then he would take him to be healed. And then 3 times he did this to him. Then in the end he asked him, will you ever ask these questions again? And the man says, never ask these questions again. And he tells him, go to Al-Kufa. He says, my family is in Egypt. He says, go to Al-Kufa, because there is a governor there where there is not a fitna that raises its head except some heads are cut off. And this was Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah. So Al-Usaybigh goes and he lives in Al-Kufa, and Umar sends a letter with him saying, I have sent you Al-Usaybigh. If anyone sits with him, whip him. No one can even sit with him. SubhanAllah, look then, did Umar radiallahu anhu save this man or not from the fitna? When the people of fitna came out and they started asking these same questions that he was asking years ago, people came to him and they told him, oh Usaybigh, there's some people now, And they have strength and numbers, and they're asking the same questions that you were asking years ago. So why don't you join them? So he scratched his back. And he said, عَلَّمَنِي